Bullies cut her dress in front of school. Her flying kick sent him into a wall. Aria Nakamura had learned long ago that silence was her shield, her sanctuary, and sometimes her curse. At 17 years old, she possessed the kind of quiet presence that seemed to render her invisible in the crowded, chaotic hallways of Westfield High School. Her petite frame, barely 5'3" and weighing no more than 110 pounds, moved through the institutional corridors like a shadow cast by moonlight, present but ephemeral, noticed only when someone deliberately looked for her. Her appearance reinforced this ghostly quality. Dark hair, the color of polished obsidian, was always pulled back in a simple ponytail that she secured each morning with the same plain black elastic band her grandmother had sent from Kyoto. The style was practical, unadorned, designed to draw no attention to the delicate features that marked her mixed Japanese and American heritage. High cheekbones inherited from her mother's samurai lineage created elegant angles in her face, while her father's American genes had given her slightly larger eyes than her fully Japanese cousins, eyes that were dark amber in certain light, almost golden when she was angry, though few people had ever seen them flash with emotion. Oversized sweaters in muted colors, gray, navy, beige, hung loose on her small frame, carefully chosen to hide the compact muscle definition that years of rigorous training had carved into her shoulders, arms, and core. She favored dark jeans that were practical rather than fashionable, and worn sneakers that made no sound as she navigated the polished linoleum floors. Every aspect of her appearance was calculated to avoid notice, to blend into backgrounds, to become part of the scenery rather than a focal point. 3 months had passed since her family had relocated from Tokyo to this mid-sized American city, following her father's promotion to head the international division of his engineering firm. 3 months of navigating a new culture, a new school system, new social hierarchies that seemed as foreign to her as ancient hieroglyphics. While other students gathered in loud, animated clusters throughout the hallways and courtyards, sharing inside jokes and weekend adventures, planning parties and discussing drama with the intensity of war correspondence, Aria moved through her days like a solitary planet orbiting at the edge of their social solar system. The language barrier that had initially challenged her had mostly dissolved through determined study and natural aptitude. Her English, learned through years of international schooling in Tokyo, was actually quite sophisticated, more formal and grammatically correct than many of her American-born classmates. But the cultural barrier remained as solid and impenetrable as reinforced concrete. The casual way American teenagers touched each other, the volume of their voices, their apparent comfort with conflict and confrontation, the complex web of social media interactions that seemed to govern their relationships. All of it felt like watching a movie in a language she almost, but not quite, understood. During lunch periods, while other students claimed their territories in the bustling cafeteria with the strategic precision of generals marking battle lines, Aria found solitude at a small table near the tall windows that overlooked the school's modest courtyard. She would eat her carefully prepared bento box, a daily reminder of home that her mother insisted on making, while reading or reviewing notes for afternoon classes. The methodical way she ate, the quiet precision of her movements, even the exotic appearance of her lunch, marked her as different in ways that seemed to create an invisible barrier around her table. She completed assignments without speaking, unless directly called upon, raising her hand only when absolutely necessary, offering answers in the soft, measured tones that her grandfather had taught her were the mark of a thoughtful person. When forced to participate in group projects, she contributed diligently but quietly, allowing others to take credit for ideas she had developed, preferring anonymity to the attention that came with recognition. Most significantly, she avoided eye contact whenever possible, having learned early in her time at Westfield High that direct gaze seemed to challenge some students in ways she didn't understand. In Japan, such behavior would have been seen as respectful, even humble. Here, it apparently marked her as weak, as prey, as someone who could be pushed without pushing back. She had perfected the art of being unremarkable, of existing in spaces without disturbing them, of moving through her days like a gentle breeze that left no trace of its passage. It was a survival strategy that had served her well in Tokyo, where standing out as a mixed heritage student in largely homogeneous classrooms had brought unwanted attention and subtle ostracism. What none of her classmates, teachers, or tormentors knew was that beneath those carefully chosen loose-fitting clothes lived muscles that had been trained and conditioned since early childhood. Every morning at precisely 5 o'clock, while her American classmates slept peacefully in their beds, dreaming of tests and dates and teenage concerns, Aria would rise in the pre-dawn darkness of their small apartment and transform their modest living room into a dojo. The ritual never varied. She would move the coffee table and chairs to the edges of the room with silent efficiency, creating a practice space barely 8 feet by 8 feet, smaller than the traditional training areas she had known in Tokyo, but sufficient for her needs. The worn carpet, a neutral beige that had seen better decades, would become her training mat. In the growing grey light that filtered through their east-facing windows, she would begin. Kyokushin karate flowed through her veins like ancestral memory, each technique memorized through countless repetitions that had begun when she was barely old enough to walk. Her movements in those early morning sessions were poetry written in violence, each form executed with the precision of a master calligrapher, creating characters with brush and ink. Her body understood the language of combat in ways that transcended conscious thought. The subtle shift of weight that preceded a devastating kick, the precise angle of elbow that could shatter ribs, the lightning-fast hand combinations that could disable an opponent before they realized they were under attack. Seiza, the formal kneeling position that began and ended each session, connected her to generations of warriors who had knelt in similar silence, centering their spirits before practicing techniques that could end lives. Her breathing during these meditative moments was so controlled, so rhythmic, that it seemed to synchronize with the heartbeat of the building itself. The forms themselves were beautiful and terrible. Taikyoku Sono Ichi, the first form she had learned as a small child, flowed into more advanced kata with names that rolled off her mental tongue like prayers. Pinan Sono Ichi, Gekisai Dai, Tsuki no Kata. Each movement told a story of combat. Each transition held the potential for lethal force. Each stance represented hundreds of hours of practice under the watchful eye of masters who had demanded nothing less than perfection. Her kicks, when fully extended in the privacy of these morning sessions, could snap heads back with concussive force. Her punches, delivered with the full rotation of her hips and the whip-like precision of her shoulders, could cave in solar plexuses or crack ribs with surgical accuracy. Her blocks weren't merely defensive. They were counterattacks designed to destroy the limbs that dared to strike at her. The family history that flowed through these morning rituals was one of warriors and champions. Her father, Hiroshi Nakamura, had been a regional champion in Japan before a devastating knee injury during a tournament final had ended his competitive career at age 25. Even now, more than 20 years later, he walked with a slight limp on rainy days, a permanent reminder of the price that martial arts sometimes demanded from its practitioners. Her grandfather, Takeshi Nakamura, had been something approaching legendary in Okinawan martial arts circles. As a young man in the years following World War II, he had trained under masters who had learned their techniques from the Chinese influences that had shaped karate in its earliest forms. His dojo in Naha had produced champions who competed internationally, fighters whose names were spoken with reverence in martial arts schools across the Pacific. When Aria was born, her grandfather had taken one look at her tiny fists, already clenched even in sleep, and declared that she would carry on the family tradition. Her first lessons had begun before she could properly walk, with exercises disguised as games that developed balance, flexibility, and the kind of body awareness that most people never achieved in a lifetime of training. Karate begins and ends with respect, her grandfather had told her during countless training sessions in his traditional dojo. But in between, it is about survival. You train so that you never have to fight. But when fighting becomes necessary, you train so that you win quickly and completely. Those words echoed in her mind during every morning practice session in their American apartment. The philosophy of overwhelming force, applied only when all other options had been exhausted. The idea that a true warrior's greatest victory was the battle that never needed to be fought. But here, in this American high school with its strange social dynamics and incomprehensible hierarchies, she was just Aria, the quiet Asian girl who spoke softly, kept to herself, and seemed to apologize for existing. The girl who walked through hallways with her eyes down, who ate lunch alone, who never complained when others treated her like an inconvenience rather than a human being. Just get through the day, she reminded herself each morning as she finished her practice and prepared for school. Don't draw attention. Don't give them reasons to notice you. Don't provide them with excuses to make your life more difficult than it already is. This mantra had become her daily prayer, repeated silently as she dressed in her carefully chosen, unremarkable clothes, as she walked the 6 blocks to school through neighborhoods that still felt foreign despite 3 months of daily navigation, as she entered the building that housed her education and her daily torment. The bullying had started small, so subtle that it could have been mistaken for innocent misunderstandings by anyone who wasn't living through it. Whispered comments about her accent when she spoke in class. Observations delivered just loudly enough for her to hear, but quietly enough to maintain plausible deniability if any adult happened to be listening. "Can someone translate that for the rest of us?" would come the whispered response whenever she answered a question in her careful, precise English. "Maybe she should go back to English class with the kindergartners," another voice would add, followed by soft laughter that rippled through nearby desks like waves spreading from a stone dropped in still water. The racial slurs came next, delivered with the casual cruelty that teenagers seem to specialize in. "Ching chong," muttered just loud enough for her to hear as she passed certain lockers, always accompanied by crude attempts at mimicking what they apparently believed was an Asian accent. The students delivering these insults would exchange glances and smirks, delighted by their own wit, congratulating themselves on humor that was neither original nor clever. Books, accidentally knocked from her hands in crowded hallways, became a daily occurrence. The perpetrators would offer exaggerated apologies. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, I didn't see you there," while their friends struggled to contain their laughter. The books would scatter across the polished floor, sometimes open to random pages, forcing her to gather them, while streams of students flowed around her like water around a stone. Her locker, which she had initially hoped might serve as a small sanctuary where she could store her belongings and gather her thoughts between classes, became another source of daily anxiety. Someone had learned her combination, probably by watching her open it during the first week when she was still unfamiliar with the mechanism, and had begun leaving gifts inside. The first had been a crude drawing of a person with exaggerated Asian features eating rice with chopsticks. The figure wore a pointed hat and had buck teeth that protruded cartoonishly from its mouth. Below the drawing, in block letters, someone had written, "Go home." Subsequent gifts included a fortune cookie with the fortune replaced by a slip of paper reading, "Your future deportation," a pair of chopsticks wrapped in a note that said, "Learn to eat like a human," and a small plastic Buddha statue with the head broken off. Each item was a small violation, a reminder that even in what should have been her private space, she was not safe from their attention. She never reported these incidents, knowing instinctively that doing so would only escalate the situation and mark her as someone who couldn't take a joke. She endured it all with the same serene expression she wore during meditation, never retaliating, never even acknowledging the attacks in any visible way. Her face became a mask of calm acceptance, revealing nothing of the calculations running constantly beneath the surface, the mental mapping of exits and threats, the continuous assessment of who was approaching from which direction and with what intent. The main instigator was Brad Morrison, a hulking 6'2" linebacker whose family had dominated Westfield's social and economic hierarchy for 3 generations. His grandfather had been mayor for 12 years, his father owned the largest construction company in the county, and his mother sat on the school board, connections that seemed to provide him with an invisible shield against consequences for his actions. Brad's physical presence was as imposing as his social position. 220 pounds of muscle, built through years of organized athletics and supplemented by what Arya suspected was pharmaceutical enhancement, though she had no proof of such suspicions. His sandy blonde hair was always perfectly styled with products that probably cost more than her family spent on groceries in a week, maintained in the kind of effortlessly tousled look that actually required significant daily effort to achieve. His Letterman jacket, worn even on days when the temperature made such clothing impractical, served as both armor and advertisement. The leather sleeves were decorated with patches commemorating various athletic achievements, district championships, all-conference selections, team captain designations, while the wool body bore the school colors of navy and gold. He wore it like a uniform that announced his status to anyone who might be confused about his place in the school's hierarchy, but it was his eyes that truly marked him as dangerous. Cruel blue eyes that seemed to find weakness the way sharks detected blood in the water, scanning constantly for vulnerabilities to exploit, for signs of fear or submission that could be leveraged for his entertainment. When those eyes fixed on a target, they promised suffering with the casual indifference of a cat toying with a wounded mouse. His closest allies were Tommy Rodriguez and Derek Walsh, each dangerous in their own distinctive ways. Tommy was lean and quick, built like a switchblade, all sharp angles and sudden movements. His dark hair was always slicked back with gel, and his smile had a nasty quality that suggested he enjoyed causing pain for its own sake, rather than for any strategic purpose. He had the kind of nervous energy that made him constantly fidget, always bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet, always looking for something or someone to focus his restless aggression upon. Derek Walsh provided the explosive temper that complemented his friend's more calculated cruelty. His red hair matched his volcanic personality. He could go from apparent calm to violent rage in the space between heartbeats, triggered by perceived slights that others might not even notice. His freckled face would flush an alarming shade of crimson when his anger peaked, and his fists had left their marks on locker doors, bathroom stalls, and occasionally other students throughout his high school career. Together, they formed a triumvirate of adolescent power that ruled their corner of Westfield High through a combination of physical intimidation, social connections, and the kind of casual cruelty that seemed to come naturally to those who had never experienced powerlessness themselves. "Look what crawled out of the rice paddy," Brad would announce with theatrical flourish whenever Arya entered the cafeteria during lunch periods. His voice would carry clearly across the large room, cutting through the normal buzz of conversation and drawing attention from dozens of nearby tables. His own table, positioned strategically in the center of the room where his pronouncements could achieve maximum audience, would erupt in dutiful laughter, his followers competing to see who could laugh loudest at his wit. The announcement would ripple outward through the cafeteria like a stone thrown into still water. Conversations would pause as students turned to look at the target of Brad's attention, some laughing along with the joke, others looking uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. most simply observing with the detached interest of spectators at a sporting event. Arya would pretend not to hear, maintaining her serene expression while making her way to her usual spot near the tall windows that overlooked the courtyard. Her movements never quickened or showed any sign that the words had reached her, though her heart rate would increase slightly and her muscles would tense in preparation for fight or flight responses that she never allowed to manifest visibly. The table she had claimed by default was small, designed for 2 people, but almost always occupied by only her. Its location near the windows provided natural light for reading and offered a view of the outdoors that helped her feel less trapped during the lunch period. But most importantly, it was positioned where she could observe most of the cafeteria while keeping her back to a wall. A strategic choice that had become second nature through months of navigating hostile territory. Mrs. Henderson, the lunch monitor whose job was ostensibly to maintain order and prevent exactly the kind of harassment that occurred daily, always seemed to be looking elsewhere when these incidents unfolded. A tired woman in her 50s who had been teaching at Westfield High for more than 20 years, she had apparently developed the selective blindness that many educators use to cope with problems they felt powerless to solve. When Brad's announcements echoed across the cafeteria, Mrs. Henderson would be checking her phone or organizing papers, or engaged in conversation with other staff members, or suddenly discovering urgent business that required her immediate attention in the kitchen area. Her ability to be absent or distracted precisely when her intervention was most needed suggested either remarkable bad timing or willful ignorance. The other teachers displayed similar patterns of convenient blindness. Mr. Peterson, who taught advanced placement history and prided himself on discussing social justice issues in historical contexts, somehow never noticed the social injustice unfolding in his own hallways. Ms. Rodriguez, no relation to Tommy, the Spanish teacher who spoke passionately about cultural sensitivity and inclusion, managed to miss the daily cultural insensitivity directed at one of her most dedicated students. Even the students who might have spoken up, those who possessed sufficient social standing to challenge Brad's behavior without making themselves targets, found reasons to look away, to suddenly become fascinated by their phones, to discover urgent conversations that required their immediate attention elsewhere. The conspiracy of silence that surrounded the daily harassment was as effective as any active participation might have been. Arya understood this dynamic with the clarity that came from having lived it before. Getting involved in someone else's harassment meant becoming a target yourself, and most people, reasonably enough, preferred to maintain their own safety rather than risk it for a stranger's benefit. The mathematics of social survival made intervention a luxury that few could afford. She had dealt with similar situations in Tokyo, where her mixed heritage had made her stand out among her fully Japanese classmates like a flower of a different color in an otherwise uniform garden. The isolation there had been more subtle, expressed through exclusion rather than active harassment, but the loneliness had been just as profound. At least here, she told herself during particularly difficult days, the situation felt temporary. Her father's work assignments rarely lasted more than 2 or 3 years, and his next promotion would likely take them to yet another new city, another fresh start, another chance to perhaps find a place where she might belong. She just had to survive until then. One day at a time, one class period at a time, one encounter at a time, the mantra of endurance that had sustained her through previous challenges would see her through this one as well. The gymnasium became her sanctuary during lunch periods when the cafeteria's hostile atmosphere became unbearable. Most students avoided the large, empty space during lunch hours, preferring the social stimulation of the cafeteria or the outdoor areas when weather permitted. For Arya, the gymnasium's echoing quiet offered a respite from the constant vigilance required to navigate the hallways and classrooms. The space itself was typical of high school gymnasiums built in the 1980s, vast and utilitarian, with polished hardwood floors that reflected the overhead fluorescent lighting in long, bright streaks. Retractable bleachers lined one wall, usually folded closed during lunch periods, creating an even larger sense of space. The walls were painted in the school colors of navy and gold, decorated with championship banners dating back decades and motivational slogans in large block letters. Excellence is not a skill, it's an attitude, and champions are made when nobody is watching. The familiar scent of athletic equipment and floor wax that permeated the space reminded her powerfully of her grandfather's dojo in Tokyo. The odors were not identical. The American gymnasium smelled of rubber and synthetic materials, where the dojo had carried hints of wood oil and traditional tatami mats. But the underlying essence was the same, a place where bodies were pushed to their limits, where discipline was learned through repetition, where character was forged through challenge. She would find a spot in the bleachers, usually several rows up, where she could observe the entrances while feeling safely elevated above the floor level. Her homework would provide convenient camouflage for her presence. Anyone glancing into the gymnasium would see simply a diligent student taking advantage of quiet space to study, nothing unusual or noteworthy about the scene. But her real purpose during these solo sessions was restoration. The peaceful silence allowed her to lower the psychological defenses that she maintained throughout the rest of the day, to breathe deeply without scanning for threats, to let her shoulders relax from the unconscious tension that had become her default posture. Sometimes she would close her eyes and visualize the kata she had practiced that morning, mentally rehearsing the movements that connected her to her heritage and her strength. It was in this sanctuary, on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, when the autumn chill had driven most students indoors, that Brad Morrison and his crew discovered her refuge. "Well, well, little China doll thinks she can hide from us." Brad's voice bounced off the gymnasium walls with amplified menace, the acoustics of the space transforming his words into something that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. He approached with Tommy and Derek flanking him like lieutenants in a conquering army, their footsteps echoing hollowly on the polished floor. Arya closed her textbook slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled, despite the adrenaline that had immediately begun flooding her system. Years of training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to think clearly when others might panic, to assess threats and opportunities with clinical precision even when her heart was racing. 3 opponents, her mind catalogued automatically. Brad, 6'2", approximately 220, right-handed based on how he carries his backpack, probably strong, but likely relying more on size than skill. Tommy, 5'10", maybe 160, quick movement suggests speed, but possibly less power. Derek, 5'11", stockier build. History of explosive anger means unpredictable but potentially sloppy technique. Environment, confined space with limited exits, hard floor surface, good for quick movements but dangerous for falls. Bleachers provide elevation advantage if retreat is necessary. Acoustic properties mean any loud noise will carry throughout the building. Tactical assessment. They chose this location for privacy, which means they're planning something they don't want witnessed. That's both good and bad. Good because it means help might arrive if someone hears disturbance. Bad because it means they feel confident about doing something they wouldn't attempt in public. All of these calculations occurred in the space of seconds while she gathered her books and prepared to stand, her expression remaining calm and neutral despite the rapid strategic planning occurring beneath the surface. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue?" Tommy sneered, stepping closer with the predatory confidence of someone who had never encountered serious resistance. "Or do you only speak fortune cookie?" Derek's harsh laughter echoed off the gymnasium walls, seeming to multiply and surround her from all directions. Maybe she's praying to her Buddha statue or whatever weird stuff they worship. I need to get to class, Arya said quietly, standing and slinging her backpack over her shoulder. Her voice remained steady and level, betraying none of the calculations running through her mind like rapid-fire computations. She moved to step around them, choosing an angle that would take her toward the main exit while keeping all three potential threats in her peripheral vision. Class doesn't start for 20 minutes, Brad said, moving to block her path with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to having his will obeyed without question. We want to have a little chat first. His positioning was strategic, close enough to intimidate without actually touching her, maintaining just enough distance to claim innocence if any adult happened to arrive, but near enough that she would have to push past him to reach the exit. Tommy and Derek had spread out slightly, not quite surrounding her, but definitely controlling the space in a way that limited her options. About what? She asked, though she already understood that this conversation had nothing to do with actual communication and everything to do with establishing dominance, with demonstrating that even in what she had thought was her safe space, she was still subject to their whims. About respect, Brad said, his smile shifting into something predatory and cruel. See, we don't appreciate foreigners coming into our school and acting like they own the place. The irony of this statement was not lost on Arya. In the 3 months she had attended Westfield High, she had done everything possible to avoid appearing as though she belonged anywhere, much less as though she owned anything. Her entire strategy had been based on invisibility, on taking up as little space as possible, on asking for nothing and expecting less. "I don't act like anything," she replied, her voice remaining steady despite the increasing tension in the air. "I just want to be left alone." "That's the problem," Tommy chimed in, his nervous energy causing him to bounce slightly on the balls of his feet. "You think you're too good for us, walking around like some mysterious ninja princess." If only they knew, Arya thought, with what might have been amusement under different circumstances, how close to the truth that accusation actually was. She was indeed trained in ways that might seem mysterious to them, and she had been raised in traditions that dated back to legendary warriors, but she had never acted superior to anyone. If anything, she had gone to great lengths to appear inferior, unthreatening, forgettable. "Look," she said, trying once more to avoid the confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. "I don't want any trouble." Brad reached out and grabbed her arm, his large hand easily encircling her slender wrist. His grip was firm, but not yet painful, a demonstration of control rather than an attempt to cause immediate harm. "Nobody said you could leave." For just a moment, Arya felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded action, the biochemical preparation for violence that had been trained into her through thousands of hours of practice. Her muscles tensed automatically, her weight shifted to her back foot. Her free hand began to move toward a position where it could break his grip with a simple rotation that would leave him gasping on the floor with a hyper-extended wrist. The technique was so deeply ingrained that it would have been like breathing, natural, automatic, devastating. Brad's larger size and weight would actually work against him in close quarters, his bulk making him slower to react when she converted his grip into a lever against his own joints. But she forced herself to relax, to suppress the trained responses that wanted to take control of the situation. "Not yet," she told herself. "Not unless you have no choice. The consequences of fighting will follow you for the rest of the school year and beyond. Only fight when the alternative is worse than fighting." "Please let me go," she said instead, her voice remaining level despite the effort required to suppress her body's natural defensive responses. Brad's grip tightened noticeably, his fingers pressing into the tendons of her wrist, hard enough to cause discomfort. "Say, please, Master Brad," he demanded, his voice taking on a tone that suggested he was enjoying this exercise of power for its own sake. "No." The single word hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down in an ancient arena. It was spoken quietly, without heat or defiance, but with an absolute finality that seemed to surprise all three boys. They had clearly expected submission, pleading, perhaps tears, anything except this calm, matter-of-fact refusal to comply with his demand. Derek stepped closer, cracking his knuckles with deliberate menace. The sound echoed in the empty gymnasium like small bones breaking. "I don't think she heard you right, Brad. Maybe her English isn't as good as she pretends." Tommy moved to block any alternate escape route, his quick movement suggesting that this was a coordinated effort they had planned in advance, rather than a spontaneous confrontation. "Yeah, maybe we need to explain it in a language she understands better." The tension in the air had become almost physical, a pressure that seemed to make breathing more difficult. Arya could feel the situation escalating beyond the point of peaceful resolution, could sense the three boys working themselves up to whatever they had planned for this encounter. Her mind began running through tactical scenarios with increasing urgency. The sound of the gymnasium door opening saved them all from discovering what would have happened next. "Hey, what's going on in here?" Coach Martinez's voice cut through the tension like a blade, sharp with authority and suspicion. His athletic build and commanding presence immediately changed the dynamic in the room as he strode across the polished floor toward their group. Brad released Arya's arm immediately, his expression shifting to innocent confusion with the practiced ease of someone who had navigated similar situations many times before. "Just talking to the new girl, Coach. Making her feel welcome, you know?" Coach Martinez was in his late 30s, a former college athlete whose playing career had been ended by injury, but whose passion for sports had led him into education. He had the kind of situational awareness that came from years of managing teenage athletes, and his suspicious gaze moved between the four students with the practiced assessment of someone who knew how to read body language and group dynamics. "Welcome her somewhere else," he said, his tone making it clear that this was not a suggestion. "Gym's off limits during lunch period. You all know that." As they filed out of the gymnasium, Brad managed to lean close enough to Arya that his whispered words were audible only to her. "This isn't over, China doll. Not even close." The threat was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions, someone who believed that his size, his social position, and his family connections made him essentially untouchable. He walked away with the swagger of a predator who had been temporarily interrupted but not deterred, already planning the next encounter. That night, alone in her family's small apartment, Arya practiced until her muscles screamed and her workout clothes were soaked with perspiration. In the privacy of their modest living room, with her parents asleep in the next room and the rest of the world locked safely outside, she moved through her forms with lethal precision, each technique executed with barely contained fury. The apartment was typical of corporate housing, functional but impersonal, furnished with pieces chosen for durability rather than comfort or aesthetics. The living room where she practiced was cramped by the standards she had known in Tokyo, but adequate for her needs. She had moved the coffee table and chairs to create a space perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet, barely large enough for her full range of movements, but sufficient for the kind of focused training that her current emotional state demanded. Her shadow moved across the walls like a vengeful spirit as she flowed from one kata to another, each form telling a story of combat, each movement containing the potential for devastating violence. Taikyoku Sono Ichi became Pinan Sono Ni, which flowed into Gekisai Dai, each transition executed with the kind of precision that could only come from years of dedicated practice. But tonight, the movements carried an edge they had lacked during her usual morning sessions. Where her morning practice was meditative, centered, focused on perfection of technique and connection to tradition, This evening session was angry. Each block was executed with the intention of shattering the attacking limb. Each strike was thrown with enough force to cave in ribs or collapse a solar plexus. Each kick was delivered with the power to break bones or send an opponent flying across the room. She could still feel Brad's grip on her arm, the casual way he had assumed ownership of her space, her time, her very person. The memory ignited something dangerous in her chest, a cold fire that threatened to burn away all the careful control she had spent years developing. Her grandfather had always said that true strength lay not in the ability to fight, but in the wisdom to know when fighting was necessary. But he had also taught her that there came times when strength without action was simply cowardice disguised as virtue, when peace without justice was merely submission to bullying. When will that time come? She wondered, as she moved through a particularly aggressive sequence of hand techniques, each strike thrown with enough force to drop a grown man. Her reflection in the apartment's darkened windows showed a figure that moved with deadly grace, each movement flowing into the next with the kind of fluid precision that marked a true martial artist. Deep in her heart, despite her conscious desire to avoid confrontation, she suspected that time would come soon. Her mother appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the subtle sounds of her daughter's late-night training. Keiko Nakamura was a small, elegant woman whose own grace of movement suggested some martial training in her past. Though she had given up active practice when Arya was born, she watched her daughter's fierce practice with the understanding of someone who recognized the signs of inner turmoil manifesting in physical expression. "Arya-chan," she called softly, using the diminutive form of her daughter's name that carried both affection and concern. "Is everything all right at school?" Arya completed her current sequence before answering, her breathing controlled despite the intensity of her practice. "Fine, Mama, just staying in practice." But it wasn't fine, and they both knew it. Keiko had seen those same movements in her husband's training years ago, back when he prepared for competitions that mattered, back when every technique had to be perfect because second place meant failure. This wasn't practice for maintenance or meditation. This was preparation for war. The conversation that didn't happen spoke volumes. Keiko understood that her daughter was dealing with challenges at school, just as she understood that directly questioning a 17-year-old about such matters was likely to result in defensive silence rather than helpful communication. Instead, she simply watched for a few more minutes, offering her presence as support without demanding explanations that weren't freely given. "Don't stay up too late," she said finally. "And remember that some battles are worth fighting, while others are worth avoiding. The wisdom is in knowing the difference." After her mother returned to bed, Arya continued practicing until well past midnight, working through every kata she knew, every combination her grandfather had taught her, every technique her father had refined through competition. By the time she finally stopped, her small apartment's living room had been transformed into a battlefield where she had fought invisible enemies with deadly precision. But the real battle, she knew, would come at school, and tomorrow was another day. The harassment escalated gradually over the following weeks, like an infection that started small but spread throughout the body with increasing virulence. Brad and his friends seemed to take her silence during the gymnasium encounter as invitation rather than deterrent, interpreting her restraint as weakness rather than control. They began timing their movements to hers with the precision of military strategists, appearing wherever she tried to find solitude with the inevitability of shadows following their caster. The library, which had initially offered refuge with its atmosphere of enforced quiet and scholarly focus, became hostile territory when they discovered her habit of studying there during free periods. They would enter in a group, their voices loud enough to violate the traditional silence, but not quite loud enough to justify intervention from the librarians. They would choose a table near hers and begin what appeared to be academic discussions, but were actually elaborate performances designed for her benefit. "I'm having trouble with this history assignment about World War II, Brad would announce, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet space. "I keep getting confused about which side the Japanese were on." "Oh, that's easy," Tommy would respond with theatrical helpfulness. "They were the ones bombing Pearl Harbor and putting Americans in prison camps." "Wait, I thought it was the other way around," Derek would add with mock confusion. "Weren't we the ones who put them in camps?" No, that was totally different," Brad would explain with exaggerated patience. "That was for their own protection and for national security. You know how they can't be trusted." These conversations would continue for the entire period she remained in the library, a constant background of historical distortion and racial commentary delivered with just enough plausible deniability that any adult who overheard would assume they were simply discussing their schoolwork. The librarians, middle-aged women who had been managing teenage behavior for decades, seemed to develop temporary hearing loss whenever these discussions occurred. The hallways became gauntlets where she never knew when someone would shoulder check her into a locker with enough force to bruise her arms or send her books scattering across the polished floor. These collisions were always accompanied by elaborate apologies delivered with theatrical sincerity. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," the perpetrator would exclaim while their friends struggled to contain their laughter. "I totally didn't see you there. You're so tiny. Are you okay? I hope I didn't hurt you. I know how delicate Asian girls are supposed to be. Maybe you should wear brighter colors so people can see you better. You know, like safety orange or something." The accidents became daily occurrences, precisely timed to happen in crowded areas where the physical contact could be disguised as normal hallway congestion. Aria learned to brace herself whenever she saw certain students approaching, to hold her books more securely, to position herself near walls when possible to avoid being knocked off balance. Her locker, which she had hoped might remain a small sanctuary in the midst of the hostile environment, became the site of increasingly bold violations. The combination that someone had observed during her first week was being used regularly now, and the gifts left inside had evolved from crude drawings to more sophisticated forms of harassment. She would open the metal door to find printouts of Asian stereotypes downloaded from the internet, cartoons of people with exaggerated features eating rice with chopsticks, traditional Chinese characters with translations that were uniformly insulting, photographs of crowded Asian cities with captions about overpopulation and poor hygiene. One morning, she discovered that someone had taped a mirror inside her locker with a note that read, "Look in here to see what a foreign invasion looks like." Another day brought a small plastic American flag planted in a pile of instant rice, with a card that said, "This is what happens when you don't assimilate properly." The most disturbing incident involved a small origami crane, a traditional Japanese symbol of peace and hope, that had been carefully crafted from what appeared to be American dollar bills. When she unfolded it, she discovered that the bills were actually realistic-looking play money printed with images of Asian caricatures instead of American presidents. Each violation was a reminder that even in spaces that should have been private, she was being watched, judged, and found wanting. The psychological impact was more significant than the physical harassment. The constant awareness that her belongings were not secure, that her personal space could be invaded at will, that nowhere in the school building could she consider truly safe. The worst part was how invisible it all seemed to everyone else. Teachers looked right through the subtle torment happening under their noses, their trained educators' eyes, apparently unable to detect the systematic campaign being waged against one of their students. Other students developed selective blindness whenever Brad's crew struck, suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere or becoming deeply absorbed in their phones whenever an incident occurred. Mrs. Peterson, The veteran English teacher who assigned essays about social justice and the importance of standing up for the marginalized somehow never noticed the marginalization occurring daily in her own hallways. Mr. Davis, the social studies instructor who taught units on civil rights and the dangers of prejudice, managed to miss the prejudice being expressed in his immediate vicinity. Even the guidance counselors, whose job was ostensibly to help students navigate social and emotional challenges, seemed to operate in a bubble of willful ignorance that protected them from having to address problems they felt ill-equipped to solve. The conspiracy of willful ignorance felt more suffocating than the actual bullying. If the harassment had been acknowledged, it could have been addressed. If adults had recognized what was happening, interventions could have been attempted. But the systematic denial of reality created a situation where Arya was forced to endure not only the daily torment, but also the gaslighting that suggested she was imagining or exaggerating her experiences. "Just ignore them," her mother advised during one of their careful conversations where more was implied than stated directly. "Show them you're better than their behavior." Her father, nursing his perpetually aching knee during one of his physical therapy sessions, offered a more direct perspective. "You want me to go to the school, talk to the principal? I can make some phone calls." "No, Dad, I can handle it." And she believed she could. Years of training had prepared her for challenges far more serious than teenage cruelty. She had faced discrimination before, had navigated hostile environments, had learned to find strength in situations that would have broken other people. The techniques her grandfather had taught her weren't just physical, they included mental discipline, emotional control, and strategic thinking that extended far beyond mere fighting. But as November turned to December and the Michigan winter began to settle over Westfield, with its characteristic gray skies and bitter winds, the incidents grew bolder, more public, more deliberately humiliating. It was as if her continued refusal to react was being interpreted as license to escalate, her restraint seen as evidence that they could push further without consequences. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in mid-December, 2 days before winter break was scheduled to begin. Arya had worn her favorite dress to school that day, a simple blue cotton piece that her grandmother had sent from Kyoto as a birthday gift the previous spring. The dress was special, not because of its monetary value, which was modest, but because of what it represented, a tangible connection to her heritage, to family members she saw only rarely, to traditions that felt increasingly distant in her American life. The fabric was a deep navy blue, decorated with a subtle pattern of cherry blossoms embroidered in silver thread, traditional enough to honor her Japanese heritage, but modern enough to be appropriate for an American high school. The cut was conservative, falling just below her knees, with sleeves that covered her shoulders completely. She had paired it with simple black tights and flat shoes, creating an outfit that was elegant without being flashy, beautiful without being provocative. She had chosen to wear it specifically because Sarah Chen, a quiet girl from her chemistry class who had begun sitting with her occasionally at lunch, had invited her to attend a small holiday gathering at her house that evening. It would be Arya's first social invitation since arriving at Westfield High, and she wanted to look appropriate for what Sarah had described as just a few friends hanging out, nothing fancy. The dress made her feel connected to home in ways that her usual school clothes never did. When she wore it, she could imagine her grandmother's approving smile, could feel the love and care that had gone into selecting the perfect gift for a granddaughter living far from family. It was armor of a different sort, not the invisibility cloak of her oversized sweaters, but a reminder of who she was and where she came from. She was walking toward her final class of the day, Advanced Placement Chemistry, when Brad Morrison stepped directly into her path near the main hallway intersection where 4 corridors met. The location was strategic. the busiest part of the school during class changes, where the maximum number of witnesses would be present for whatever performance he had planned. "Well, look at this," he announced loudly, his voice cutting through the normal buzz of hallway conversation and drawing attention from dozens of nearby students. "Princess Asia decided to dress up for us today." A crowd began to gather with the inevitable magnetism that surrounded any potential drama in the social ecosystem of high school. Students slowed their movement toward their next classes, some stopping entirely, others pretending to continue walking while obviously listening and watching. The anticipation was palpable, the kind of electric expectation that preceded either entertainment or disaster. Arya tried to step around him, but Tommy Rodriguez and Derek Walsh materialized as if summoned, completing the human wall that trapped her in the hallway intersection. Their coordination suggested that this encounter had been planned in advance, probably discussed during lunch or between classes, with roles assigned and objectives agreed upon. "That's a pretty dress," Brad continued, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over the immediate area. "Shame it makes you look like a geisha who got lost on her way to the whorehouse." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, the kind of uncomfortable sound that accompanied jokes that crossed lines most people weren't entirely comfortable crossing. Some students looked genuinely uncomfortable with the turn the confrontation was taking, but none seemed willing to intervene or speak up in her defense. Arya felt heat rise in her cheeks for the first time in months, her careful emotional control cracking slightly under the combination of public humiliation and the deliberate sexualization of clothing that was important to her. But she managed to keep her expression neutral, her voice steady. "Excuse me," she said quietly, trying once more to move past them. "I need to get to class." "Where are you going, sweetheart?" Brad asked, as she attempted to turn and find an alternate route. "We're just getting started with our cultural appreciation lesson." "Leave me alone," she said, her words barely audible above the growing murmur of the crowd. "What was that?" Brad cupped his ear with theatrical exaggeration. "Sorry, I don't speak Chinese, or Japanese, or whatever language they use in whatever country you're actually from." The crowd had grown larger, forming a rough circle around the confrontation with the instinctive organization of spectators at a fight. Students were pulling out phones now, some to record whatever was about to happen, others to text friends about the drama unfolding in the main hallway. She said, "Leave her alone." Sarah Chen's voice cut through the crowd as Arya's only friend pushed forward, trying to help despite the obvious risk to her own social standing. "Come on, Brad, just let her go to class." Arya's heart sank as Sarah inserted herself into the situation. Her friend was small and quiet like herself, lacking the social armor that might have protected her from retaliation. By speaking up, Sarah was making herself a target, potentially sacrificing her own safety for someone she barely knew. "Oh, look," Tommy sneered, his nervous energy causing him to bounce slightly as he spoke. "The geisha has a white savior. How progressive." "Back off, Sarah," Derek added, his face already beginning to flush with the anger that always seemed to simmer just below his surface. "This doesn't concern you, unless you want to make it concern you." "Bullying concerns everyone," Sarah replied, though Arya could hear the tremor in her voice that betrayed her fear. She was standing up despite being scared, which made her courage all the more remarkable. Brad's eyes lit up with malicious inspiration, the look of someone who had suddenly seen an opportunity to create even more entertainment than he had originally planned. "You know what? You're absolutely right, Sarah. This does concern everyone." He raised his voice to address the entire hallway, playing to his audience with the skill of a natural performer. "Everyone should see what happens to people who think they're too good for American hospitality. Everyone should understand what we do to foreigners who come to our school and act like they own the place." The crowd pressed closer, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be worth witnessing. Phones were raised higher, fingers poised over record buttons, social media accounts ready to broadcast whatever humiliation was about to unfold. Before Arya could react, before she could deploy any of the defensive techniques that had been drilled into her through years of training, Brad reached out with both hands and grabbed the neckline of her beautiful blue dress. Time seemed to slow as his large hands seized the delicate fabric that had been embroidered with such care by artisans in Kyoto. For just an instant, she could see exactly what was about to happen, could understand the deliberate cruelty of what he had planned, could feel the violation that was about to occur. With one violent motion, he yanked downward and outward, using his significant size and strength advantage to tear the delicate cotton fabric from collar to hem. The sound of ripping cotton seemed to echo forever in the sudden absolute silence that followed. It was a sound like heartbreak given audible form, like the destruction of something beautiful and irreplaceable, like the tearing of connections that had stretched across an ocean. Arya stood frozen in the center of the circle, her dress hanging in tatters around her body, the careful embroidery torn and ruined, her white slip visible to dozens of staring eyes and recording phones. The dress that had made her feel connected to home, that had carried her grandmother's love across thousands of miles, that had been chosen with such care for her first American social gathering, was destroyed. The careful emotional control she had maintained for months, the serene composure that had been her shield against every previous humiliation, cracked like ice under the weight of too much pressure. The part of her that had counseled patience and restraint suddenly went silent, replaced by something much older and more dangerous. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about her grandmother's gift, her family's honor, her heritage being literally torn apart for the entertainment of people who saw her as less than human. This was about 3 months of accumulated humiliation finally reaching a critical mass that could no longer be contained. This is what helplessness feels like, she realized with crystal clarity as she stood in her ruined dress while phones recorded her humiliation for digital immortality. This is what happens when you let others define your boundaries. This is what happens when you mistake restraint for strength. "Oops," Brad said with mock concern, his voice carrying clearly in the shocked silence. "Looks like your cheap foreign clothes can't handle American strength. Maybe you should shop at Walmart like the rest of us." Something fundamental shifted inside Arya's chest, like tectonic plates moving after building pressure for years. The part of her that had counseled endless patience and peace suddenly went completely silent, replaced by a voice that sounded exactly like her grandfather's, speaking with the authority of generations of warriors. "Some battles choose you, Arya-chan. When they do, you must be ready. Honor is not about avoiding conflict. It is about being worthy of the strength you carry." She looked up at Brad Morrison, and for the first time since arriving at Westfield High School, she met his gaze directly and held it. What he saw there made his satisfied smirk falter slightly, then disappear entirely. Her eyes, usually downcast and deferential, now blazed with something that made him take an unconscious step backward. "You just made a very big mistake," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silence with a quality that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone who heard it. Brad recovered quickly, puffing out his chest and playing to his audience with the bravado that had served him well throughout his reign as Westfield High's dominant predator. "Oh yeah? What are you gonna do about it, China?" He never finished the word. Arya moved like lightning given human form, like violence transformed into poetry, like years of disciplined training suddenly unleashed with surgical precision. Her right foot snapped upward in a perfect mawashi geri, a roundhouse kick that began at her hip and transferred every ounce of her body weight through the ball of her foot into Brad's solar plexus. The technique was flawless. Textbook execution of a kick that her grandfather had made her practice 10,000 times, that her father had refined through competition, that she had perfected through countless morning sessions in their small apartment. Her supporting leg provided perfect balance. Her hips generated maximum power. Her timing was precise to the millisecond. The kick connected with Brad's midsection just below his sternum with the force of a battering ram concentrated into an area the size of a silver dollar. The impact lifted his 220-pound frame completely off the ground, his feet leaving the polished linoleum as if gravity had temporarily released its hold on him. He flew backward through the air for what seemed like an impossible distance, 6 feet, maybe 7, before his body collided with the metal lockers that lined the hallway. The crash was tremendous, a sound like thunder indoors, like a car accident contained within the confines of a school building. The impact was so violent that the lockers actually dented inward where his body struck them, the metal warping around his frame like sculptured evidence of the force involved. The sound of his body hitting steel was followed by perfect, absolute silence. Brad slumped to the floor like a marionette whose strings had been cut, gasping desperately for breath that wouldn't come, his face turning an alarming shade of purple as his diaphragm spasmed from the precise strike to his solar plexus. His hands clutched at his chest and stomach, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, his eyes wide with shock and the primal fear that comes with the inability to breathe. The hallway had become a tableau of frozen figures, dozens of students standing in stunned silence as they processed what they had just witnessed. The tiny, quiet girl who had never raised her voice, who had endured months of harassment without visible reaction, had just sent the school's most feared bully flying through the air like he weighed nothing at all. "Oh my God," someone whispered, their voice barely audible in the shocked quiet. Tommy Rodriguez was the first to recover from the collective paralysis, his nervous energy finally finding focus as he lunged forward with his fists raised and fury contorting his features. "You crazy bitch, I'll kill you for that." But Arya was no longer the passive victim he had been tormenting for months. She moved like water flowing around an obstacle, sidestepping his wild, angry swing with fluid grace that made his attack look clumsy and amateurish by comparison. His momentum carried him past her, off balance and vulnerable, and she used his own forward motion against him. Her hands shot out with the speed of striking snakes, one grabbing his extended right arm just above the wrist, the other seizing his shoulder. Using the principles of leverage and momentum that were fundamental to jiu-jitsu, she guided his charging motion in a direction he hadn't intended to go, directly into the same bank of lockers that had just become acquainted with Brad's body. Tommy's face met the metal with a sickening crunch that was audible throughout the hallway. The sound of his nose breaking was distinct and nauseating, followed immediately by a spray of blood that painted the beige lockers in abstract patterns of red. He bounced off the metal surface and stumbled backward, his hands flying to his face as blood poured between his fingers. "Jesus Christ," he mumbled through the blood and damaged cartilage, his voice now carrying a permanent nasal quality that would serve as a lasting reminder of this encounter. "What the hell are you?" Derek Walsh, witnessing the devastating fate of his two friends, began backpedaling rapidly. The explosive anger that usually characterized his responses to conflict had been replaced by something much more basic and primal: fear. His face, already flushed with his characteristic rage, had gone pale beneath the freckles, and his hands were shaking visibly. "This is insane," he stammered, continuing to back away while keeping his eyes fixed on Arya as if she were a dangerous animal that might attack if he moved too quickly. "You're insane. This is totally insane." Arya didn't pursue him. She simply stood in the center of the hallway circle, breathing normally despite having just delivered 2 devastating attacks, her stance relaxed but ready, her expression calm and controlled. She looked like someone who could end worlds without breaking a sweat, someone who had access to levels of violence that most people couldn't even imagine. The torn pieces of her blue dress hung around her like battle flags, but she gathered them against her chest with one hand while maintaining eye contact with every person in the hallway. Her other hand remained free and ready, positioned where it could react instantly to any additional threats. The crowd had grown silent, except for Brad's continued gasping and Tommy's muffled groans. Students who had been recording the initial confrontation now lowered their phones, suddenly uncertain whether they wanted permanent documentation of what they had witnessed. The entertainment they had expected had transformed into something much more serious, much more real, much more potentially dangerous for everyone involved. "I am someone who tried very hard to avoid this moment," Arya said finally, her voice carrying to every corner of the hallway with perfect clarity. Each word was precisely enunciated, delivered with the kind of controlled intensity that made people listen whether they wanted to or not. "I am someone who believed that walking away was strength, that silence was wisdom, that peace was always possible. I am someone who spent 3 months being patient while you proved to me, day after day, that my patience was being mistaken for weakness." She looked down at Brad, who was finally beginning to breathe normally again, but remained slumped against the dented lockers like a broken doll. "I was wrong." The 2 words hung in the air like a judgment, like a declaration of war, like a promise that everything had changed permanently and irrevocably. The crowd parted before her like the Red Sea as she walked toward the nearest bathroom, students pressing themselves against lockers and walls to avoid any possibility of physical contact. They watched her pass with the kind of awed silence usually reserved for natural disasters or supernatural phenomena. Things that were powerful beyond human understanding and dangerous beyond human control. Behind her, Brad finally managed to wheeze out something that might have been an apology, but she didn't turn around. Tommy was still bleeding profusely from his shattered nose, and Derek had disappeared entirely, presumably to find a teacher or administrator who could deal with a situation that had escalated far beyond anything they had experienced before. "Let them remember this," Arya thought as she pushed through the bathroom door, her torn dress rustling around her with each step. "Let them all remember what happens when peaceful people reach their limit. Let them remember that silence is not the same as helplessness, and that patience has boundaries that should not be tested." In the bathroom mirror, she could see herself clearly for the first time in months, not as the invisible girl who had tried so hard to avoid notice, but as the warrior her grandfather had trained her to be. The girl in the reflection stood straight and tall, her eyes bright with purpose, her presence substantial and undeniable. She was Arya Nakamura, and she had finally remembered who she was.